My mother kicked me out after finding out that I am pregnant and called me a disgrace. Now she wants to be in my daughter's life after finding out who her father is? I was 18 when I told my mother I was pregnant. She gave me 2 hours to pack and get out. Said I'd chosen to be a whore, I could figure out the consequences alone. Changed the locks while I sat on the front step with 2 garbage bags of clothes and nowhere to go. My daughter's father was a one-night thing during freshman orientation at college. I didn't even know his last name, just that he went by Alex and was visiting from Switzerland. Never saw him again after that night. Didn't have his number, didn't know his school, nothing. I dropped out, moved into a shelter, had Jana alone in a county hospital while my mother told everyone I'd run off to be a stripper in Vegas. 5 years of absolute hell followed. Waiting tables at a diner where customers grabbed my ass for $2 tips. Living in a studio apartment with black mold and roaches. Jana sleeping in a dresser drawer because I couldn't afford a crib. Food stamps, WIC appointments, walking 4 miles to work because the bus didn't run that early. My mother lived 20 minutes away in her 4-bedroom house. Never called, never visited. Told family I was dead to her. My sister Denise would secretly meet me at parks, bring Jana clothes from consignment shops, but she was too scared to do more. Mom had threatened to cut her off too if she helped me. I made it work though. Got my GED through an online program while Jana slept. Started community college when she turned 3. Found better waitressing jobs, saved every penny, moved us to a safer apartment. Jana was brilliant, funny, started reading at 4, could do basic math before kindergarten. Everything I did was for her. Last month, a man walked into the restaurant where I worked. Expensive suit, Swiss accent, kept staring at me. Finally asked if I'd gone to State University 5 years ago. My heart stopped. It was Alex, but now he went by Alessandro Moretti. His family owned a luxury hotel chain across Europe. He'd been trying to find me for 2 years after his cousin showed him my picture from the university's orientation archive. He'd hired investigators, searched social media, spent thousands trying to track down a girl he'd spent one night with because he couldn't forget me. I told him about Jana, showed him her picture. He cried right there in the restaurant. His father had been pressuring him to marry some heiress, but Alessandro had refused, kept thinking about the American girl who'd quoted Shakespeare while drunk and laughed at his terrible jokes. He wanted to meet Jana immediately. Within a week, he'd set up a trust fund for her, bought us a house, insisted on back paying 5 years of child support at $10,000 a month. His family flew in from Switzerland, embraced Jana like she'd always existed, showered her with presents and affection. That's when my mother reappeared. She showed up at my new house with flowers and tears, saying she'd been wrong, she'd missed us so much, family should forgive. The neighbors had told her about the Mercedes in my driveway, the Swiss license plates, the delivery trucks from high-end stores. She'd done her research, found out exactly who Alessandro was, what his family was worth. She wanted to be part of Jana's life now that Jana came with a trust fund and Swiss finishing school potential. I let her in, let her talk. She went on about second chances, how young I'd been, how she'd only wanted what was best. Then she saw Jana's picture with Alessandro's family at their Swiss estate, and her eyes lit up. We should plan her 6th birthday together, she said. Maybe in Switzerland? I've always wanted to see Geneva. That's when Alessandro walked in from the kitchen. He'd heard everything. My mother practically glowed, extended her hand, started gushing about her precious granddaughter. Alessandro looked at her hand like it was covered in sewage. "You're the woman who threw out your pregnant daughter?" he asked quietly. My mother stammered about tough love, teaching responsibility. Alessandro pulled out his phone, showed her something. Her face went pale. "This is the police report from the shelter where your daughter spent her first month homeless. It lists her as an abandoned youth. This is the social services file showing she applied for emergency housing while 8 months pregnant. This is the hospital record showing she gave birth alone while listed as indigent. Would you like me to continue?" My mother tried to explain, but Alessandro cut her off. He swiped to another screen and turned it toward her, his voice still quiet but cutting. The shelter intake form filled the display with my name at the top, and a red checkbox next to abandoned minor. My mother opened her mouth, but Alessandro spoke over her, asking if she'd like him to continue through the 5 years of documentation his investigators had compiled. I stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, my hands gripping the frame while I watched her face cycle through excuses. She tried saying something about not understanding how bad things were, about thinking I'd figure it out, about being angry and scared herself. Alessandro scrolled through more screens without breaking eye contact with her, showing hospital records and social services files like he was presenting evidence in court. My mother's makeup started running as tears mixed with the foundation she'd carefully applied before coming here. She pivoted hard then, reaching toward me with trembling hands and saying she'd been so scared that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd thought about me every day. I stepped back before she could touch me, my voice surprisingly steady when I told her she needed to leave now. Alessandro moved beside me without a word, his presence solid and supporting as I walked to the front door and opened it. My mother stood in the middle of my new living room, looking between us like she couldn't believe this was happening. She asked if we could please just talk, if I could give her a chance to explain properly. I kept holding the door open, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it, but my hand didn't shake on the doorknob. She gathered her purse and the flowers she'd brought, walking past me with her head down and more tears streaking her cheeks. I watched her get into her car and pull away before I closed the door, then leaned against it for a long moment while my legs felt weak. Alessandro and I sat at the kitchen table after I checked that Yana was still asleep upstairs, her nightlight glowing soft through the crack in her door. He apologized for ambushing me with the documents, explaining that when he'd hired investigators to find me, they'd compiled everything as part of their search. The files showed the full picture of what I'd survived, and he'd kept them in case I ever needed proof. We talked through what happens next, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. I expected him to push for immediate involvement with Yana, for family visits and plans, but instead he surprised me by suggesting we start with legal paternity confirmation before anything else. He said he wanted everything official and protected, that Jana and I deserved that security after managing alone for so long. 2 days later, we met with Leah Mercer in her downtown office, the kind of place with thick carpet and framed law degrees covering the walls. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, wearing a practical suit and no-nonsense expression. Leah explained that Alessandro had hired her specifically to represent my interests, not his, and that she worked for me alone even though he was paying her fees. She walked us through the process for a court-admissible DNA test, the kind that would hold up legally if we ever needed it to. It felt strange having a lawyer who answered only to me, but also safer than I'd expected. Leah asked detailed questions about what I wanted protected and what worried me most, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. She pulled out a folder of documents and walked us through financial boundaries before any test results came back. Alessandro agreed immediately to put the back child support into an escrow account that would only release after paternity was confirmed through official channels. The house he'd bought went into my name with legal protections written in, so he couldn't take it back regardless of what happened between us. I felt overwhelmed looking at all the paperwork, page after page of terms and clauses, but Leah explained each section in plain language. She pointed out every safeguard she'd built in, every protection that kept Yana and me secure even if things went wrong. I signed where she indicated, my hand cramping by the end, but grateful for every word that stood between us and uncertainty. My phone buzzed as we finished, a text from Denise warning me that Mom was calling every relative we had. She was telling them I'd kept Yana secret out of spite, that I was being cruel by not letting her be a grandmother now. The old fear of being isolated from family hit hard, that feeling of being cut off and alone that had defined the last 5 years. But I reminded myself that most of those relatives had believed I was a Vegas stripper anyway, that they'd never reached out when I actually needed help. That evening I sat with Yana on her bed, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm while she looked up at me with curious eyes. I explained in simple terms that a friend from Europe wanted to meet her, someone I'd known a long time ago before she was born. She asked if he was nice, and I told her we were going to find out together, slowly, that we'd take our time. I didn't use the word father yet, because nothing was officially confirmed, and I wouldn't make promises I couldn't keep. Yana nodded seriously, then asked if the friend liked the same cartoons she did. I said I didn't know, but we could find out, that she could ask him questions and decide for herself how she felt. At the end of the first week, we met at a public park on a sunny Saturday morning, the kind with newer equipment and wood chips instead of concrete. Alessandro brought a simple soccer ball, nothing fancy or expensive, and asked Yana about her favorite color and whether she liked playgrounds. She was shy at first, standing half behind my leg, but curious enough to answer that she liked purple, and yes, she liked swings. I stayed close while they kicked the ball back and forth on the grass, Alessandro keeping his movements gentle and his voice calm. Yana stopped the ball with her foot and asked why he talked funny, tilting her head like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. Alessandro laughed, a real warm sound, and explained he was from Switzerland where people speak differently than we do here. She wanted to know if they have McDonald's there, and he said yes, but the menu is in French and German instead of English. I watched him keep everything age-appropriate and honest, not making big promises about trips or presents, just answering her questions like she was a real person whose thoughts mattered. They kicked the ball some more while I sat on a bench nearby, close enough to intervene but far enough to let them interact. Yana's guard dropped a little as they played, her movements getting less stiff, though she still glanced back at me every few minutes to make sure I was there. On day 8, my mother left a voicemail that I listened to twice before deleting. She said she forgave me for keeping Jana from her all these years, that she wanted to move forward as a family for Jana's sake, that she was ready whenever I was. I felt angry listening to it, then just tired, that bone-deep exhaustion that comes from dealing with someone who refuses to understand. I didn't call back because I needed time to think, and I was done rushing into things that hurt me. The phone sat silent on my kitchen counter while I made Jana's lunch, spreading peanut butter the way she liked it, and I realized that not responding felt better than trying to explain myself one more time. The next morning, I dropped Yana at kindergarten and drove straight to work for the early shift. My lunch break came at noon, and I walked 3 blocks to the public library, the same one where I'd studied for my GED while Yana was a baby. I found an empty computer terminal in the back corner and pulled up legal information websites about grandparents' rights in our state. The laws were narrow, requiring proof of an existing relationship or evidence that denying contact would harm the child. My mother had neither, but the websites warned that determined grandparents could still file petitions and drag families through court battles that cost thousands in legal fees. I opened a notebook and wrote down specific statutes, case names, filing requirements. The act of gathering information made the fear feel smaller, more manageable, like something I could prepare for instead of just dread. I took photos of the relevant pages with my phone and emailed them to Leah with a short message asking if we should be worried. Back at the restaurant, I tied on my apron and started taking orders for the dinner rush, my mind still half focused on legal terminology. The next afternoon, my phone buzzed during my break and Leah's name appeared on the screen. She wanted to schedule a consultation specifically about protecting Yana and me from legal harassment, explaining that we needed to create a paper trail and establish clear boundaries before my mother could gain any legal foothold. The appointment was set for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, and I arranged to swap shifts with another server to make it work. That Friday night, 2 regular customers sat in my section whispering just loud enough for me to hear about the Mercedes with Swiss plates parked outside and whether I was dating some kind of prince. My face burned hot, but I kept my pen steady on the order pad, focusing on writing down their food choices in clear handwriting. My manager noticed me standing frozen by the kitchen door a few minutes later and asked quietly if I was okay, offering to move me to different tables if people were bothering me. I thanked him but said I could handle it, though my hands shook slightly as I carried plates back out to the dining room. On Saturday afternoon, Denise texted asking if we could meet for coffee somewhere out of the way, and I suggested a place across town near the highway, where nobody from our neighborhood would recognize us. She was already sitting in a corner booth when I arrived, her college textbooks spread across the table but her eyes red like she'd been crying. We ordered coffee and she told me she wanted to support me, but was scared Mom would cut her off financially, that she was only halfway through her degree and couldn't afford to lose her tuition payments. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, telling her I understood completely, and that she'd already helped more than anyone by sneaking us supplies during those awful years. We both cried a little, quiet tears that we wiped away quickly so the other customers wouldn't stare. The DNA test happened on Monday morning at a medical office downtown with official documentation and chain of custody procedures that felt more serious than I'd expected. A technician in blue scrubs explained each step while writing information on labeled forms, then swabbed Yana's cheek and Alessandro's with long cotton sticks. Yana giggled and asked if they were checking for cavities like at the dentist, and Alessandro smiled and said something similar. We agreed without speaking, not to tell her what the test was really for until we had confirmed results, keeping our explanations simple and honest, but not scary. Jana skipped out to the car talking about how the stick tickled, while Alessandro and I exchanged looks that said we were both relieved it was done. Week 3 brought the lawyer consultation where Leah spread options across her conference table like cards in a complicated game. We could establish a formal custody arrangement through the courts, create privacy protocols to keep this situation out of gossip circles, and send a cease and desist letter to my mother if she kept harassing us. The clarity helped even though the paperwork looked endless, stack after stack of forms that needed signatures and notarization. Alessandro and I spent 2 hours that afternoon drafting a co-parenting outline that started with supervised visits and built gradually based on Jana's comfort level. Leah suggested specific schedules with backup plans for holidays and sick days, making it feel real and manageable instead of scary and overwhelming. We both signed the draft to show good faith while we waited for test results, our signatures looking official at the bottom of the page. On Thursday, my phone rang during my dinner shift, and I saw Jana's school number on the screen. The administrator's voice was calm but firm, explaining that my mother had showed up at the office claiming to be the grandmother and asking about pickup procedures. I told my manager I had an emergency and left work immediately, my hands shaking with protective anger as I drove the 6 blocks to the school. The administrator assured me they hadn't released any information and asked if I wanted to file a formal restriction to prevent future incidents. I said yes without hesitation, filling out the paperwork right there in the office while Yana played on the playground, unaware of what had happened. Through Leah, I sent my mother a written letter the next day, establishing a no-contact boundary and explaining that any further attempts to access Yana or spread family rumors would result in legal action. Signing it made me feel sick with guilt, but also strangely powerful, like I was choosing safety over keeping the peace for the first time in my life. That night after Yana fell asleep, I started a private journal documenting every interaction, voicemail, and incident involving my mother. Leah had said it could matter in court someday, but it also helped me process everything, turning the chaos into organized facts on paper. Writing down what actually happened made it harder for me to doubt myself later, creating a record that couldn't be argued with or rewritten. The next afternoon, Alessandro showed up at my apartment with a catalog from some European furniture company, pages marked with sticky notes showing elaborate dollhouses that cost $3,000. He spread the catalog on my kitchen table and pointed to a Victorian-style mansion with working lights and hand-carved details, saying Jana deserved beautiful things after the years we'd struggled. I stared at the price tag and felt my stomach twist because that was more than 2 months of my old rent, more than I'd spent on furniture for our entire apartment. I told him it was too much too fast, that Yana was 5 and would be just as happy with a $30 plastic one from the toy store. He looked confused and a little hurt, like he genuinely didn't understand why throwing money at everything wasn't the solution. We sat there for 20 minutes talking through it until I explained that experiences mattered more than expensive stuff, that taking her to the children's museum or the zoo would create better memories than a dollhouse she'd outgrow. Alessandro listened and actually adjusted his thinking instead of pushing back, suggesting we plan a weekend trip to the science center with the interactive exhibits Yana loved. That willingness to hear me and change course mattered more than any gift he could buy. 3 days later, the DNA results arrived by courier in an official envelope with lab seals and legal stamps. Alessandro came over that evening, and we sat on my couch reading through pages of genetic markers and probability percentages that all confirmed what we already knew. We called Jana in from her room where she'd been coloring and sat her between us on the couch, keeping our voices calm and simple. Alessandro told her he was her daddy, and that he'd been looking for us for a very long time, that he didn't know about her before, but now he did, and he wanted to be part of her life. Jana processed this quietly, her face serious in that way kids get when they're trying to understand something big. Then she asked if this meant she had grandparents in Switzerland like her friend Maya had grandparents in California. We said yes, that she had a whole family there who wanted to meet her when she was ready, but only when she felt comfortable. She nodded and went back to her coloring like she needed time to think about it alone. The next morning, I met with Leah at her office, and she recommended a child therapist named Phyllis Mercer, who worked specifically with kids going through major family changes. We scheduled an intake appointment for the following week, giving Yana a safe space to process everything without us hovering. Leah explained that professional support wasn't admitting failure. It was protecting Yana from being overwhelmed by adult situations. I was learning that asking for help didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was smart enough to know when we needed guidance. That same afternoon, my phone rang during my shift at the restaurant, and I saw a local area code I didn't recognize. The voicemail asked me to call back regarding a comment on the secret air story that was apparently spreading online. My hands started shaking as I listened to the reporter explain she'd heard about Alessandro's daughter and wanted to verify facts before publishing. I immediately called Leah from the restaurant bathroom, my voice tight with panic. She told me to activate the privacy plan we'd discussed, which meant zero engagement with any media and letting the story die from lack of information. We agreed to say nothing publicly and treat silence as our strongest defense. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox with my mother's handwriting on the front. Inside was a 5-page letter that mixed apology language with conditions and demands, saying she was sorry for her mistakes, but also listing all the places she wanted to take Jana, and suggesting we plan a family trip to Switzerland together. She wrote about how much she'd missed us and how families should forgive, but every paragraph came with strings attached and expectations that I'd forget 5 years of abandonment. I read it twice and recognized the manipulation pattern clearly now, seeing how she was trying to force her way back in by acting like everything was already forgiven, and we were already a happy family again. She wanted access to Jana and Alessandro's world without actually earning back trust or proving she'd changed. The letter went into my documentation folder with all the other evidence. The following Tuesday, I met with Phyllis at her office while Alessandro waited in the lobby. She asked detailed questions about Jana's routine, her personality, how she'd handled changes in the past, what worried me most about this transition. Then Alessandro came in, and we both explained the situation from our different perspectives while Phyllis took notes. After an hour, she brought Jana in for a session using toys and art supplies, keeping everything gentle and age-appropriate. Jana drew pictures and played with dollhouse figures while Phyllis asked casual questions about her family and feelings. At the end, Phyllis told us to keep Jana's schedule very predictable and introduce changes gradually, letting Jana control the pace of relationship building. She gave us specific scripts for talking about hard topics and ways to check in with Jana without making her feel interrogated. That night, Denise texted asking if I'd consider supervised limited contact with our mother to reduce the chance she'd file for grandparents' rights out of spite. I sat staring at my phone, feeling torn between protecting Denise from being stuck in the middle and knowing my mother hadn't earned access to Jana yet. Part of me wanted to make things easier for my sister who'd already sacrificed so much by helping us secretly all those years. But another part knew that giving into manipulation just to avoid conflict was exactly how my mother had controlled everyone for decades. I told Denise I needed to think about it and talk to my lawyer first. The next morning, Leah walked me through the legal requirements for grandparents' petitions in our state, showing me the specific statutes that said without an existing relationship, my mother had almost no standing to demand visitation rights. She suggested offering mediation first as a good faith gesture that would also create legal documentation if my mother refused to be reasonable or made unrealistic demands. We could show a judge we'd tried to work things out and my mother had been the obstacle. I agreed to try mediation, but only with strict conditions written out beforehand about what contact would look like and what boundaries were non-negotiable. That afternoon, I found another note from the reporter tucked into my apartment door. this one offering to meet off the record just to hear my side before the story got twisted by other sources. I held the paper in my hand, feeling tempted to set the record straight and control the narrative. Then I remembered Leah's warning that engaging at all gave the story fuel and attention, that silence was the fastest way to make it boring and irrelevant. I tore up the note and threw it in the trash. The following week at Jana's second therapy session, Phyllis had her draw a picture of her family and her feelings. Jana drew herself in the middle with a thought bubble full of question marks above her head. When Phyllis gently asked what she was wondering about, Jana said she was scared her daddy would go away again like he did before, even though she knew it wasn't his fault that he didn't know about her. Hearing her name the fear out loud helped us address it directly, instead of pretending everything was fine. That weekend, Alessandro came over with a big craft store bag, and we sat at the kitchen table with Jana between us. He pulled out a blank monthly calendar with big squares for each day, and 2 sheets of stickers showing airplanes, video cameras, hearts, and stars. Jana's eyes went wide, and she immediately reached for the stickers, while Alessandro explained that we were making a special chart to show when he would visit and when they would talk on the computer. I watched her pick through the stickers carefully, choosing purple hearts for video call days and gold stars for in-person visits. Alessandro showed her how to count the days between visits, pointing at each square and letting her place the stickers herself. She stuck them slightly crooked and overlapping, but she was so focused and serious about it. When we finished, she wanted to hang it in her room right away, so we taped it to the wall next to her bed where she could see it first thing every morning. She stood back and admired it, then asked if she could add more stickers for special days like her birthday. Alessandro said yes and handed her the whole sheet, and I felt something tight in my chest loosen just a little watching them plan together. 3 days later, Alessandro called while I was folding laundry and asked if his parents could have a few photos of Jana for their private family album. My whole body tensed up and I put down the shirt I was holding. I told him I needed to think about it and we could talk later. After we hung up, I sat there feeling my protective walls slam back into place, thinking about strangers across the ocean having pictures of my daughter. That night, I talked to Leah about it and she helped me understand that some photo sharing was reasonable, but I could set strict rules. The next day, I told Alessandro he could have 3 pictures that I would choose, with written agreement that nothing went on social media and the photos stayed within his immediate family only. He agreed without argument and thanked me for trusting him enough to share even that much. I picked out 3 photos from the last month showing Jana reading a book, playing at the park, and smiling at the camera. Sending them felt like handing over pieces of her that I couldn't protect anymore, but I did it anyway because Alessandro had earned some trust. The following morning, I woke up to 5 missed calls from Denise. I called her back and she told me to check Mom's Facebook page immediately. I opened the app with my stomach already twisting and found a new album titled My Precious Girls, with about 20 old photos of me and Denise as kids. The captions talked about cherished memories and unbreakable family bonds, and how blessed she was to have such beautiful daughters. There were pictures from birthdays and holidays I barely remembered, all of them from before I got pregnant. Not a single photo from the last 5 years because she hadn't been there. The comments were full of relatives saying how sweet the memories were, and what a wonderful mother she must be. I felt sick reading it, seeing her rewrite history for everyone who didn't know the truth. Denise had already screenshot every photo and caption and sent them all to me as documentation. She said she wanted me to have proof of what Mom was doing in case it mattered later. I saved everything to a folder on my phone labeled Evidence and tried to turn the hurt into something useful instead of letting it spiral me into old patterns of doubt. That afternoon, Leah called to tell me she'd arranged mediation with Waverly Mercer, a woman who worked with families in conflict. The session was scheduled for 2 weeks out and the ground rules were already written into the agreement. My mother had to apologize specifically for each action she took, commit to starting therapy within 1 week, and accept in writing that any contact with Jana was completely my decision, with no guaranteed timeline. Leah said my mother's lawyer had reviewed the terms and she'd agreed to attend. I was surprised she'd accepted such strict conditions, but Leah reminded me that my mother probably thought she could charm her way through the mediation and get what she wanted anyway. We would see if she actually followed through or if this was just another manipulation. 2 nights later, I worked the dinner shift at the restaurant and everything was normal until table 12. A regular customer who came in every Thursday sat down and I took his order like always. When I brought his food, he looked up at me with this smirk and said loud enough for nearby tables to hear that he'd heard I'd landed myself a rich Swiss guy, and was I sure I hadn't trapped him on purpose. I froze for a second with the plate still in my hand, my face burning hot. Then I put the plate down carefully and told him that was completely inappropriate, and I needed him to stop. He laughed like it was a joke, but my manager had already heard from across the room. She walked over and told him calmly that he needed to pay his bill and leave immediately. He tried to argue, but she stood firm and said the restaurant didn't tolerate customers harassing staff. He threw cash on the table and left while other customers watched. My manager squeezed my shoulder and told me to take a 5-minute break in the back. I stood in the kitchen shaking with anger and relief that someone had actually backed me up. The next Monday, Alessandro and I met with our lawyers at Leah's office. She had prepared a temporary parenting plan that laid out everything in careful detail. Alessandro would visit every other weekend for 8 hours on Saturday, with Wednesday evening video calls. Financial support would go through a structured account with documentation. Major decisions about Jana's education, health, and activities required us both to agree. Everything was typed up officially with signatures and witness lines. Alessandro and I sat across from each other at the conference table and signed our names on multiple copies. Having it all documented in legal language felt safer than just trusting each other's word. The structure protected Jana most of all, making sure neither of us could make sudden changes without proper process. Leah filed the plan with the court that same afternoon, so it became part of the official record. The mediation session happened on a gray Thursday morning in Waverly's office downtown. My mother arrived exactly on time, wearing a nice dress and carrying tissues in her purse. Waverly sat between us and reviewed the ground rules before we started. My mother cried almost immediately, saying she'd been young and scared herself when I got pregnant, that she'd made a terrible mistake. But then she started adding justifications about trying to teach me responsibility, and thinking tough love was the right approach. I stayed calm even though my heart was pounding, and I interrupted her. I said I needed her to acknowledge specific actions without making excuses. I listed each thing she did out loud, asking her to confirm she remembered kicking me out with 2 hours' notice, changing the locks, refusing all contact for 5 years, telling family I was dead to her. She cried harder but kept trying to explain her reasoning. Waverly stopped her and said the exercise required acknowledgement without justification. My mother struggled with that, wanting to defend herself, but eventually she agreed to write everything down as a homework assignment. Waverly scheduled a follow-up session for 2 weeks later to review what she wrote. The next day, I met with Phyllis to talk through the mediation. She read Waverly's notes carefully and asked me how I felt about the session. I told her it was harder than I expected to hear my mother cry, but that I was glad I'd required real accountability. Phyllis helped me think through whether supervised contact could eventually be safe for Jana. She said my mother would need to show sustained change over time, not just apologize once and expect access. We worked out specific criteria together. 6 months of weekly therapy with proof of attendance. Written accountability for her actions without excuses or justifications. Respecting every boundary I set without pushback or manipulation. Only after meeting all 3 requirements consistently would we even consider a supervised meeting between her and Jana. The timeline felt right, giving my mother a chance to do real work while protecting Jana from someone who hadn't proven herself trustworthy yet. On Saturday morning, the reporter's story finally ran in a local online news site. I made myself read it with my coffee, expecting the worst. But it was actually respectful and focused on privacy rights for families in complex situations. The reporter had fact-checked everything, and since I'd declined to comment, most of it was speculation about legal boundaries that died down within 2 days. I felt relieved it wasn't the gossip piece I'd feared. A few people at work mentioned seeing it, but nobody pushed for details. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Denise. She said Mom had been texting her all morning complaining that I was keeping her grandchild from her and asking Denise to talk to me on her behalf. But this time, Denise didn't forward Mom's complaints or try to mediate between us. Instead, she texted me to say she'd told Mom directly to work with the mediator and stop trying to use her as a go-between. She said she was done being stuck in the middle and that Mom needed to earn her way back into our lives through her own actions. I texted back thanking her and telling her I was proud of her for setting that boundary. It felt like maybe Denise was finally finding her own voice instead of just trying to keep everyone happy. The next morning, Alessandro called while I was making Jana breakfast and asked if we could meet at the park near my apartment to talk about his schedule. I agreed, and we sat on a bench while Jana played on the swings 20 feet away where I could see her. He pulled out his phone calendar and suggested staying for a full week instead of the 3 days we'd planned, saying his family wanted more time with Jana and he could work remotely from the hotel. I felt my shoulders tense up and told him the therapist had been clear about gradual increases, that jumping from 3 days to 7 was too much too fast for Jana. He looked frustrated, ran his hand through his hair, started to argue that she seemed fine. I cut him off and explained that just because she seemed okay didn't mean we should push harder, that kids often showed stress later in unexpected ways. He sat quiet for a minute, watching Jana pump her legs on the swing, then nodded and said he understood even though it was hard to leave when things were going well. I appreciated that he listened instead of pushing back, that he was willing to slow down even when it went against what he wanted. We agreed to stick with 3 days this visit, and add 1 more day next month if Jana handled the transition well. It felt like we were actually learning to work together instead of just each giving up something to keep the peace. 3 days later, I got an email from Waverly with an attachment showing my mother had completed her first therapy intake appointment. The proof was a signed form from a licensed therapist confirming the date and time of the session, along with a treatment plan outline for weekly appointments going forward. I stared at the document for a long time, wanting to feel hopeful, but mostly feeling skeptical. One appointment didn't erase 5 years of abandonment or change decades of her being controlling and conditional. Waverly's email was professional and neutral, noting the progress without making it sound like more than it was. She reminded me that sustained change takes months, not weeks, and that this was just the first concrete step. I saved the email to a folder I'd created for all the mediation documentation, adding it to the growing pile of evidence that tracked everything. That afternoon, I drove to my old neighborhood for the first time since we'd moved. I parked outside the building where Jana and I had lived in that moldy studio apartment for 3 years. The paint was still peeling off the front door, and the parking lot still had the same potholes filled with oily water. I sat there with the engine running, windows up, and the memories hit me like a physical weight. The smell of mildew that never went away no matter how much bleach I used. Jonna crying from hunger while I waited for my paycheck to clear so I could buy formula. Walking 4 miles to work in the dark because the bus didn't run early enough for my shift. Counting coins to see if I had enough for the laundromat, or if we'd wear dirty clothes another week. The fear that lived in my chest every single day. The constant calculation of which bill to skip so we could eat. I gripped the steering wheel and reminded myself why I was so careful now. Why I questioned everything and built safety nets and refused to rush into trusting people. That wasn't paranoia or being difficult. That was wisdom I'd earned by surviving when nobody helped us. That was the instinct that had kept Jonna and me alive when we had nothing. I pulled away from the building after 10 minutes and drove home to our safe apartment with working heat and no roaches. Grateful and also still angry at how hard it had been. Jonna had a rough bedtime that night, crying into her pillow about being confused. I sat on the edge of her bed and asked what was confusing her. She said she didn't understand why she had to go to Alessandro's hotel sometimes instead of him always coming to our house. That it felt weird having 2 places and not knowing which one was really home. My chest ached watching her try to process something that didn't make sense at her age. I pulled her favorite stuffed rabbit from the shelf and told her we were going to create a special routine just for when she went between houses. We practiced it together right there in her room. First, she'd pack the rabbit in her little backpack. Then we'd sing the ABCs together while she put on her shoes. Then she'd give me 3 hugs and I'd give her 3 kisses before she left. When she came back home, we'd do the whole thing in reverse. She stopped crying and made me practice it 5 times until she felt sure she could remember. By the end, she was giggling when I pretended to forget which letter came after M. I tucked her in and promised we'd do the ritual every single time, that it would help her feel secure even when the location changed. The mediation follow-up session happened on a Tuesday morning at Waverly's office. My mother arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with a folder on her lap. Waverly called us back and we sat in the same chairs as last time, the same distance apart. My mother opened her folder and pulled out 3 handwritten pages. Waverly asked her to read them aloud. My mother's voice shook as she started listing specific things she'd done. Kicking me out with 2 hours' notice when I was 18 and pregnant. Changing the lock so I couldn't come back. Refusing to answer Denise's calls when she begged for help getting me into a shelter. Telling extended family I'd run off to be a stripper instead of admitting I was homeless. Never visiting the hospital when Jonna was born, even though Denise told her which one. Living 20 minutes away for 5 years and never once checking if we were alive. The list went on for both pages. She cried while reading, but she didn't stop to make excuses or explain her reasoning. When she finished, she looked at me and said she was sorry for each specific thing she'd done. It wasn't a perfect apology, and I could tell she still wanted to defend herself, but it was more honest than anything she'd said before. I sat there letting the words land without rushing to make her feel better, or tell her it was okay. After a long silence, I told her I accepted this as a first step, not as absolution, and that she'd need to keep proving herself through actions. Waverly made notes and scheduled our next check-in for a month later. I met with my restaurant manager the next day during the slow period between lunch and dinner. I explained that I needed to adjust my schedule to be home for Jonna's bedtime routine on the nights Alessandro wasn't visiting. He pulled up the staff calendar on his tablet and we worked through it together. I'd drop 2 evening shifts per week and pick up the busy lunch shifts on those days instead. The lunch shifts actually paid better because of higher table turnover, and the business lunch crowd tipped more consistently. He said I'd earned first choice on the schedule after being reliable for 3 years, and that he'd rather work with me than lose me to another restaurant. I thanked him and felt a small surge of relief that this piece was falling into place. The logistical wins were adding up slowly, each one making the whole situation feel more stable and less like it could collapse at any moment. Alessandro and I spent 2 hours at a coffee shop drafting a joint statement for Jonna's school. We kept it simple and factual. Jonna's father had recently been located after a long search. We were establishing a co-parenting arrangement. Both parents requested that any questions or concerns be directed to us privately, rather than discussed with other parents or staff. We asked that Jonna be supported without being made to feel different, or like she was the subject of gossip. Alessandro emailed it to the principal who called me that afternoon. She said she appreciated us being proactive and agreed to brief Jonna's teacher and the front office staff privately. They'd make a note in the system about pickup authorization and redirect any questions to us. She promised they'd watch for signs Jonna was struggling and let us know immediately. I hung up feeling like we'd protected her from at least one source of potential drama. Phyllis called me on Friday afternoon. She said she'd reviewed all the mediation notes and my mother's therapy documentation and felt comfortable clearing a short supervised meeting between me and my mother before considering any contact with Jonna. The meeting would happen at the mediation office with Waverly present, so we'd have a safe, neutral space. If things went badly, Jonna wouldn't be affected because she wouldn't know it had happened. If things went well, we could consider next steps. I agreed to the meeting and we scheduled it for the following Thursday. I spent the next week feeling anxious and practicing what I wanted to say, writing things down and crossing them out, trying to prepare for a conversation I didn't know how to have. The supervised meeting was harder than I expected. I sat across from my mother in Waverly's office with a box of tissues on the table between us. Waverly explained the ground rules and then asked my mother to read her written apology. It was longer than what she'd read at mediation, covering all 5 years in detail. She listed specific times she'd refused help, specific lies she'd told family, specific moments she'd chosen her pride over my survival. She talked about getting the call from Denise that I'd given birth alone and choosing not to go to the hospital. She described seeing Yana's picture for the first time 2 years later and feeling nothing because she'd convinced herself I deserved whatever happened. Her voice broke multiple times, but she kept reading. When she finished, she set the papers down and cried without trying to explain or defend herself. I sat there and let the words land, let myself feel the anger and hurt without pushing it away to make her feel better. After several minutes, I told her I heard what she said. I didn't say I forgave her because I wasn't there yet. I didn't say it was okay because it wasn't. But I acknowledged that she'd done the work of writing it honestly and reading it without making excuses. Waverly asked what I needed from my mother going forward. I said consistent therapy, respect for every boundary I set, and time to prove she'd actually changed. We spent the rest of the session negotiating what limited contact might look like. No overnight visits with Jana until further notice. No unsupervised time alone with her for at least 6 months. Periodic reviews every 3 months based on Jana's well-being and whether my mother kept attending therapy. She could be called Grandma, but with strict rules that could be pulled back immediately if she crossed any line. My mother agreed to everything without arguing or trying to negotiate for more. She said she understood she'd destroyed my trust, and that earning it back would take years, not months. Waverly documented everything we agreed to and said she'd send a written summary within 2 days. I left the office feeling exhausted, but also like the boundaries were finally clear and fair. My mother would have a role in Jana's life, but with training wheels that wouldn't come off until she'd proven herself trustworthy through sustained action over time. Jana's birthday was 3 weeks away, and I spent a Tuesday evening making a list of what we'd need for a park party. Balloons, paper plates, a sheet cake from the grocery store, maybe some simple games like tag and duck duck goose. Alessandro stopped by that night to drop off some papers from Leah and saw my notebook on the kitchen table. He asked what I was planning, and I explained the park idea, how Jana's kindergarten friends would come and we'd keep it simple and fun. He got quiet for a minute, then suggested he could hire an event company that did princess parties, or maybe rent out a venue with activities. I appreciated the offer but told him no, that 6-year-olds didn't need fancy entertainment, and Jana would have more fun running around with her friends eating cake. He looked disappointed, but then asked what he could do to help instead. I put him in charge of decorations and games, giving him a budget of $50 and a list of the dollar store items we'd need. The next day, he texted me pictures of streamers and balloons he'd picked out, asking if the colors looked good together. It felt normal in a way that mattered more than any expensive party could. My mother called 2 days later while I was folding laundry. She asked if Jana might want to visit Switzerland for her birthday, maybe see the Alps and stay at one of the family hotels. I stopped mid-fold and told her clearly that wasn't happening, that we were focusing on small local visits for now and international travel was off the table completely. She tried to push back gently, saying it would be educational for Jana and the family really wanted to meet her. I repeated myself more firmly, explaining that rebuilding trust meant respecting boundaries without arguing every time. She went quiet and then said, okay, that she understood. No guilt trip, no manipulation, just acceptance. I hung up feeling surprised and a little hopeful that maybe the therapy was actually working. Leah scheduled a meeting at her office on Friday afternoon to finalize everything legally. She had a stack of papers spread across the conference table when Alessandro and I arrived. The parenting plan with our agreed schedule, the child support trust structure, and documents for filing everything with the court. We spent 2 hours going through each section, making sure we both understood what we were signing. Leah explained how the trust worked, that money would flow in monthly, but I'd work with a financial advisor to manage it responsibly. She'd already set up an appointment for me with someone who specialized in helping people who suddenly came into money, teaching them how to budget and invest instead of just spending. The advisor's name was printed on a business card she handed me. First meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. Alessandro signed everything without hesitation, and I signed too, my hand shaking slightly because it all felt so official and permanent. Leah said she'd file the parenting plan with the court by Monday, and that we'd have legally recognized co-parent status within a few weeks. Walking out of that office, I felt like the ground under my feet was finally solid instead of constantly shifting. Alessandro asked if I wanted to grab coffee and talk, so we went to a quiet place a few blocks away. He looked nervous, stirring sugar into his espresso, then admitted his father Daniel had been calling him every other day about settling down. His father kept hinting that I'd be acceptable as a match given Jana's existence, that it would legitimize everything and make the family situation cleaner. I felt my stomach drop because I'd worried this might come up eventually. Alessandro quickly added that he'd told his father no, that romance wasn't on the table right now and maybe not ever. We needed to be stable co-parents first, and that had to be the priority, not some arranged relationship to make his family happy. He said the respectful distance we were keeping mattered more than any grand gesture or relationship could, that proving we could work together for Jana was what counted. I thanked him for being honest and agreed completely, relieved that we were on the same page. Some things were more important than fairy tale endings, and Jonna's stability was one of them. Waverly sent me an update email the next week saying my mother had completed 3 therapy sessions, and the therapist noted she was engaging seriously with the work. The email included a note that real change took months or years, not weeks, but the initial signs were encouraging. I read it twice, feeling my automatic skepticism soften just slightly into something that might become conditional trust eventually. I wasn't ready to believe she'd changed yet, but I could watch her actions and see if they stayed consistent over time. Words were easy, but showing up to therapy every week and respecting boundaries without complaint was harder. The first supervised visit happened on a Wednesday afternoon at a family center downtown. I drove Jonna there and walked her inside, where a staff member met us in the lobby. My mother was already in the visit room, sitting at a small table with coloring books and crayons set out. I stayed in the building but not in the room, sitting in the waiting area with a book I couldn't focus on reading. The staff member had explained the rules to my mother beforehand. No gifts, no promises about future visits, no asking Jonna to keep secrets, just simple conversation and activities together. After an hour, the door opened and Jonna came out holding a colored picture of a butterfly. My mother followed behind, keeping appropriate distance and not trying to hug Jonna goodbye. She thanked the staff member and left through the side exit like we'd agreed. Jonna was quiet in the car, and I didn't push her to talk right away. When we got home, I made her a snack and sat with her at the kitchen table, asking gently how she felt about seeing her grandmother. Jonna said Grandma seemed nice but also sad, and that they'd colored together and talked about favorite animals. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see her again soon, maybe in a while but not next week. I told her that was completely okay, that she got to decide the pace and nobody would force anything. Her mixed feelings made sense, and I was proud of her for being honest about them. We agreed to think about it and talk to the therapist at our next appointment before scheduling another visit. Jonna's birthday party happened on a sunny Saturday morning at the park near our apartment. Kids started arriving around 10, parents dropping them off with wrapped presents and promises to pick them up by noon. Alessandro showed up early to help me set up, hanging streamers from the pavilion posts and arranging the folding tables. Jonna ran around with her friends, playing tag and laughing so hard she got hiccups. We did simple games like musical chairs and red light, green light, then brought out the cake with its messy grocery store frosting and 6 candles. Everyone sang and Jonna blew them out in one breath, her face glowing with happiness. My mother arrived at 11 for her supervised 30-minute window, standing at the edge of the pavilion and watching quietly. She'd brought no gifts as instructed, just herself, and she smiled when Jonna waved at her between games. When her time was up, she said goodbye to Jonna without drama and walked back to her car, leaving exactly when she was supposed to. I watched her go and felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of hope that this could actually work if she kept following the rules. Denise met me for lunch the following Tuesday at a sandwich place halfway between our apartments. She looked different somehow, more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. Over turkey clubs, she told me she'd set a boundary with our mother, saying she wouldn't listen to complaints about me anymore, and that if Mom wanted to talk about me, she could do it with her therapist instead. Mom had pushed back at first, but Denise had held firm, and now their conversations were shorter but less toxic. We talked about what it meant to be sisters instead of just 2 people who survived the same difficult mother, making plans to hang out more often and build our own relationship separate from family drama. It felt good to have an ally who understood where I'd been and wasn't asking me to forgive faster than I was ready. The community college sent my acceptance letter for spring semester classes on Thursday. I'd applied weeks ago but hadn't let myself believe it would actually happen. 3 classes to start with: business fundamentals, English composition, and intro to accounting. The schedule worked perfectly with Jonna's kindergarten hours and Alessandro's visit days, and the financial stress that used to crush me wasn't there anymore. I could afford textbooks without choosing between them and groceries, could focus on studying instead of working double shifts. Sitting at my kitchen table with that acceptance letter, I thought about the future I'd always wanted for Jonna and myself, the one I'd been building toward through 5 years of hell and survival. It was finally becoming real, not because someone rescued me, but because I'd fought for it, and now had the support to make it happen. The ground felt solid under my feet for the first time in 6 years, and I was ready to keep moving forward. Alessandro left for Switzerland on a Tuesday morning, and Jonna stood at the window watching his car disappear down the street, her hand pressed against the glass. We'd set up the video call schedule before he left, specific times marked on her calendar with special stickers she'd picked out herself. That first call happened at bedtime, and she showed him her room through the tablet, pointing at her toys and talking about kindergarten. He listened carefully and asked questions, and when we hung up, she counted the days until his next visit using the stickers we'd stuck on the wall calendar. The system held better than I expected, giving her something concrete to track instead of just waiting and wondering. She knew when to expect him, and that made the distance easier somehow, turned his absence into something manageable instead of scary. My mother kept going to therapy every week, and I got the attendance confirmations from her counselor as required. We scheduled monthly supervised visits with checkpoints every 3 months to review whether the arrangement was working for Jana. The pace felt slow, but that was intentional, putting Jana's security ahead of my mother's wants. She showed up on time for visits, followed the rules without pushing back, and didn't try to manipulate her way into more access. The lack of drama surprised me more than anything because I'd expected her to test boundaries or make demands. Instead, she seemed to understand that this was her only path back, and she needed to walk it carefully. Denise started meeting me for coffee every other week, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with our mother, building our own relationship separate from family problems. Late one evening after Jana fell asleep, I sat in our living room with the lights off, just thinking. The apartment was quiet and safe. Nothing like those first nights in the shelter when Jana slept in a dresser drawer because I couldn't afford a crib. The contrast between then and now hit me hard, how far we'd come from that county hospital where I'd given birth alone. I thought about the roaches in our old studio, the customers who grabbed my ass for $2 tips, walking 4 miles to work in the dark. Those memories didn't fade just because things got better, and I didn't want them to. Needed to remember where we'd been, so I never took this stability for granted. Gratitude and caution lived together in my chest, both equally real and necessary. Our new normal was messy and structured and completely ours. Jana had 2 parents who talked respectfully and coordinated schedules, who put her needs first even when it was hard. She had a grandmother earning her way back in with strict boundaries and regular checkpoints, an aunt who was becoming a real friend instead of just a scared sister. And she had a mother who'd survived hell and built something solid, who knew exactly how much it cost to get here. Everyone ended up in a steadier place than where we started. Not perfect, but genuinely better, and that was enough for now.